The forge ate the night and spat it back as light, an orange, wet glare that washed the faces of men into relief and then swallowed them again. Sparks ran like brief stars across the concrete. The air tasted of hot oil and iron and a sweetness of burning coal. Frederick Brackett stood at the rim of the test cell, sleeves rolled, palms dark with scale, listening as if the thing inside had a pulse he could read. If this story matters, stay with us, subscribe, hit like, and tell us 7 in the comments. The machine inside the cage had been called worse names in the yards: clumsy, overbuilt, a tractor with armor. Outside, enemy propagandists sneered at its silhouette and at the clanking gait of its tracks. Inside the city, behind corrugated roofs and guarded gates, it was an argument in metal, a problem to be solved. The stakes were small and enormous at once. Range, reliability, and the ability to carry men back across ocean and desert were not abstractions. They were the difference between a convoy reaching the front and a convoy melting into confusion. They were the difference between a crew coming home and not coming home at all. Brackett had learned to speak to alloys. He called it learning the metal's language because it required patience and listening more than brute force. When a rivet snapped under stress or a gear showed hairline heat checks, he read the pattern the way a doctor reads a pulse. Tonight, the test cell was a throat. They would force the machine to speak until it either told them what to fix or proved it could be trusted. Samuel Ortiz moved like a younger hand of the foundry, quick, careful, always a half step from some disaster he could see but not yet avert. He was still learning the rhythms, when to let the press fall, when to wedge a pry bar under a flange, when to hold a hot mask over his mouth to keep the ash from learning his lungs. He had a photograph tucked behind his locker, 2 small children, a woman with a determined jaw, and he had sent letters that were folded twice and twice again so they would not crease on the long journey to a tin box in some port city. He wanted this machine to work because work meant wages and because work meant the possibility of a future where his children could run in a park without the crack of anti-aircraft guns in the distance. They had been failing for weeks. The first runs expelled clouds of unaccountable smoke. Bearings heated and seared through their housings. A new cam design would shear unexpectedly, throwing timings off by degrees that mattered over an hour. Each failure took apart a night and put it back together in trials and in arguments. Engineers scribbled on grease-stained paper while foremen hammered on tables. A draftsman named Harold Wentworth, a man who kept his pencils in parallel and spoke in clipped suggestions, sketched an impeller that promised to pull air where the old design pushed it in angry eddies. They tried different heat treatments, tempering times, stretched an extra half hour so the crystal structure of the steel would be kinder. They would quench in oil or in air, depending on what the metal had taught them last. The test cell door banged, then sealed. Men moved into positions like players taking places on a stage. The machine, studded, armored, facing the lane that led out to a narrow strip of hardened ground, shivered under the cables that tethered it for its trials. Its engine, a block of cylinders and pipes, was a clenched heart beneath thick covers. Brackett had insisted a stethoscope be run across its casings. He liked to hear the difference between a benign thrum and the onset of harmonic whispers that predicted fracture. "Warm the bearing slowly," he said. His voice was neither sharp nor soft. It belonged to someone who had spent years saying small, necessary things in the same tone. We don't want to deceive the metal into thinking it's had a winter when it hasn't. Outside, the guards' boots receded. The city beyond the factory hummed with its own exigencies. Blackout curtains, the distant beat of air raid sirens sometimes, the steady grinding need to send steel where steel was required. Within the factory, time had a different density. Minutes were compacted by lack of sleep and the pressure of demand. Deadlines were given the texture of iron filings that clung to every surface. Brackett bent, fingertips searching the cooled arc of a piston. He rubbed at a hairline mark and felt the bumpy grain of a metal that had been persuaded to take a shape against preference. "It tells you," he murmured, half to Samuel, half to the metal itself, "when it's gone soft. You can read what's coming in the flake." Samuel watched him, and in that watching, learned more than any lecture could teach. The foreman, Robert Kine, limped to a console with a strap across his shoulder. He kept his left arm close, as if in habit, a small scar puckering at the wrist where a piece of a failed press had once found purchase. His injury was a reminder of what happened when a machine did not behave. He had sworn never to let another man get the same wound on his watch. The runs began. The engine coughed into life, and a low animal sound filled the room that was at once mechanical and intimate. Sparks flared across the test cell frame as the dynamometer swallowed torque. Numbers flickered: RPM, torque, temperature. Engineers read them as one reads a map with fog on it. How far you could trust the metrics before the margins dissolved into heat. They pushed it. They loaded it with simulated weights, pulleys, and brakes that tried to make the engine plead for mercy. For 12 hours it coughed and growled and demanded adjustments. Gaskets were swapped. A new cooling duct, inserted through a hesitation and then fastened with trembling hands, rerouted the airflow from a turbulent eddy into a calmer stream. Welding seams that had splintered under strain were ground back and re-welded with a different rod. Each small victory was its own exhalation. Each setback was rearranged into a question. When the endurance test crested into the late hours, everyone in the cell had become an ear tuned to the heartbeat of the thing. Brackett's jaw was raw from constant clenching. He had a cot folded against the wall, thin padding, and a blanket that smelled of engine oil. He had slept there during other campaigns when a deadline had made normal sleeping hours a dangerous luxury. His life had been smoothed into this pattern. Come to the factory, stay until the metal had learned what it was supposed to do, go home only briefly to collect a letter and return. "Listen," Brackett said at one point, placing his palm flat against the casing. The sound was steady. It was not the quick, precise tick of early rotation, nor the low, abrasive rasp that had marked previous disasters. It carried a steadiness like a man with a day's work behind him moving with a sure step. "It held," Samuel whispered, as if the words might shatter the fragile arrangement of parts. The phrase circulated like a benediction. Men nodded, but there was no sudden jubilation. They had learned not to celebrate until bolts were tight and acceptance signatures were signed, and the first field units took the thing into territory where it could not be retrieved with a crane. They were wearily reverent. They had seen machines hold for hours and then fail under conditions that didn't look like anything but weather and misfortune. At dawn, they shut down the cell and let the thing cool. This, too, was a ritual. Metal, angry with heat, had to be coaxed into rest. Brackett took the cover off one of the pistons, a test piece they'd been monitoring, and found a hairline crack he hadn't known to expect. He ran his thumb along the fracture and felt the texture of a fatigue that had been prevented but not erased. "It saved us," he said, not exactly to Samuel, but to the room. "And it warned us." They cleaned and packed, annotating logbooks with notes that would be read by men who would never set foot inside the cell. The factory's work was always, in part, a conversation with absent readers, pilots, tank crews, field maintenance teams, men whose lives the machines touched only when the rubber met mud. Brackett folded a page of his notes and tucked it between the worn leather covers of his journal. It would be a line in a future report, a bullet point among many that would be proof enough. The factory itself was secret in the sense that it was walled and watched and counted as a precious node in a larger war effort. But secrecy wasn't merely fences and codes. It was also the way ordinary life reshaped itself around the exigency. Lunches were eaten beside steel plates. Romances were brief and practical. Letters were folded and sealed with more haste than love. Men came seeking work and found purpose the way one finds it in a shared task of great danger, by doing things others could not do, and by taking risks that were measured in ways that mattered. Harold Wentworth, the draftsman, lingered by a drafting table long after the rest had left. His pencil had drawn the impeller that had smoothed air and saved temperatures. There was joy in that, but it was a quiet thing, an internal recognition of a problem undone. He thought in lines and arcs and the language of tolerances. He kept his hand in a pocket where a small worn compass lay, and he often traced circles when he felt the pressure coming. "That fan," he said to Brackett once, "it makes the engine breathe like a man who has been given a second wind." Brackett had only nodded. He recognized the metaphor. He had used similar ones with operators who might otherwise be lost in numbers. The machine, for Brackett, always read as a living thing only to the degree that the living would grant it care. They built other things in the factory. Fenders, turrets, transmission housings, but the tank remained the central argument. It was a weight on tracks, armor plates like pages of book stacked against a soldier's vulnerability. It was a mobile workshop, a heated coffin, a hope. Propaganda on both sides reduced complex machines to taunts and nicknames. The enemy might call it a tractor. The men in the plant called it an answer. Production ramped with a merciless pace. A montage of weeks collapsed into days. More men hired, more presses installed, lines extended into adjoining sheds. X-ray inspections took on the cadence of prayer. Seams were passed under the scanner and then handed to an inspector who tapped them with a small hammer to listen for hollowness. Welding teams worked in duos, one holding a shield, the other guiding a torch that left beads like braided rope. Each bead was a small claim against fracturing. Each weld sealed a promise. The logistics of scale were often numbing in their detail. Deliveries of alloy arrived by the ton. Chromium and nickel to harden the matrix, small percentages of molybdenum to keep it resilient at temperature. Furnaces were balanced as if on a set of scales that were sensitive to a whisper. Conveyor belts carried castings to lathes where hands with gloves and faces turned to shields trimmed imperfections. The plant manager, a stern woman named Eileen Marsh, who had come from an administrative role at a pre-war foundry, presided over rosters with the kind of calm that keeps panic from setting like rust. "The Army wants 100 a month," she said during one meeting, and the floor of the conference room seemed to tilt under the weight of the number. The engineers answered with what they had and with what they needed. Brackett listened and adjusted his own mental ledger. More inspection time here. Hold off a new heat treatment until the test beds confirm. There were human costs. Robert Kane was pulled from one of those beds and told to rest his wrist. He protested and plunked his crutches beside the bench like a badge. He had been close to losing a piece of himself to a machine that had misbehaved when a press misaligned. He returned to the line with an arm sling and told tales in low voice about the morning he had been saved from ruin by a junior mechanic who had noticed an odd sound. When the plant's men talked about near misses, the tone was not bragging, but a kind of sober recognition. Letters arrived from fronts. A pilot's clipped note about a mission flown in an aircraft powered by an engine built across town. A sergeant's thanks for sending a replacement part that reached a field repair crew in time. The men pinned those letters on a corkboard near the canteen and read them aloud between cigarettes and coffee. Sometimes the letters were only names. Sometimes they bore the signatures of men who would not return. The factory kept its own ledger of griefs. When a crew failed to come home, the mood in the plant folded inward for a day. The presses slowed, the music on the radio was turned down, and men walked softly. Alongside the human stories ran the technical problem cycles. A gearbox would show a tendency to climb temperature under load. An idler wheel would vibrate at certain speeds, inducing oscillations in the track that ate into rubber. They experimented with suspension geometry, altering the length of torsion bars a half-inch at a time, and then testing to see how much stress it distributed before returning. They tried alternative alloys for track pads, choosing proportion between hardness and ductility. In the shop, a small furnace glowed like a second sun, where samples were annealed and quenched. Brackett oversaw microstructures with a loupe, his eyes finding grain boundary issues in slices of metal like a reader finding marginalia. Many nights Brackett sat alone with a cracked piston that had been retired from a test run. He would place it under a lamp and study the fracture, how the bands of fatigue mirrored the cycles of torque the machine had seen. He kept it as a talisman and as a reminder of limits. When he touched it, he thought of the men who would ride these machines once they left the gates. Drivers who would sleep in the belly of them, and gunners who would angle into starlit silence. He thought of a family he had left in previous postings, of letters received and sometimes returned. The piston was a small broken moon he kept on a shelf. Its presence around the plant was a quiet concession of the exchange at work. To get strength, one must risk fracture. The first time a prototype rolled down the testing lane and into a shallow, rutted field beyond the plant, a group of mechanics and engineers followed it like anxious relatives. Lieutenant Frank Reynolds, a pilot-turned-liaison officer for armored trials, rode along in the command hatch with a paper map and a face mapless in expression. He was not a test driver by trade, but he had the poise of someone who had lived where noise and fire were ordinary. The machine moved with a surprising grace for its bulk, the tracks chewing ground and throwing clods in measured arcs. The suspension took an irregular bump without the nervous pitch that had haunted earlier trials. The engine, Brackett's crucial heart, kept beat steady. "It's gonna be judged for how it moves," Reynolds said later, removing his cap and rubbing at his forehead with a hand that had ink stains and grease on the thumb, "not just how it fights." "That's what we've given it," Brackett answered, "a better walk." They had called it a tractor in enemy pamphlets. In the English press, it had been lampooned as ungainly. There was some truth to the barbs. Its profile was ungainly in certain light, and it did not have the elegance of lighter designs. What it had been given was a kind of brute comprehension, armor where needed, a powerful engine that could pull its weight and then some, and components designed with an eye to field repair. They had avoided delicate systems in favor of robustness that could be mended with the tools a mechanic could carry. That philosophy had come from many hands, but it also had come from a specific culture inside the plant. The idea that machines in war must be mendable in mud as much as they must be efficient. Harold Wentworth had argued for accessible plate seams. Brackett had insisted on assemblies that could be taken apart without special jigs. The choices were ethical as well as technical. Make a machine that can be repaired at the roadside, and you increase the crew's chance of survival. When word came that the field command had accepted the first production batch, the factory did what factories always do. It shifted from the intimacy of trials to the rhythm of scaled production. Lines lengthened. Men who had been stitched into the project as specialists found themselves supervising teams of trainees. Samuel Ortiz became an instructor for a rotation of newly drafted hands, showing them how to check a weld for porosity and how to listen to a bearing before it said its last word. He taught them to fold letters with fewer creases so they would survive the journey home. The maiden convoy that carried the first dozen completed vehicles out of the yard was guarded and punctual. Men gathered, Eileen Marsh at the gate, Brackett watching from a slight ridge with a thermos clutched in cold fingers, Harold with his compass in his pocket. They loaded the beasts onto flatbeds where needed or sent them trundling along escort trucks when roads permitted. There was a curious hush to departures. It was not silence of peace, but silence of attention. Many of the men had put their hands on the steel and imprinted themselves on it. They watched the machines go out and felt as if their own hands were torn away with them. The operational deployment that followed was a procession of blurred maps and figures. Convoys crossed water and desert. Crews practiced field fixes under starless skies. Logistic fingers stretched to keep fuel and ammunition moving. Reports came back with an odd mixture of admiration and fatigue. The tanks, when they rolled into combat, did not transform the world with the instant of a miracle. They did, however, perform a steady work, carrying men, bearing fire, breaking through points that had been defended. There were moments when the moral tension of this work sharpened into sight. A letter arrived in the plant from a maintenance sergeant stationed in a city that had been heavily hit during a campaign. He wrote of gratitude for replacement parts that had kept crews mobile, and in the same breath he described the ruins they passed. Rows of buildings that had been luminous in ordinary life and now stood like blackened ribs. The letter found the shelf where Brackett kept the cracked piston. He read it twice and then sat with it for a long hour. "You ever think about the people who will be using these?" Samuel asked one evening as they closed up. He did not mean the crews alone. He meant the civilians folded into the geography of war, the families in towns along supply routes, the children in cities that would feel the shock of conflict. Brackett did not answer immediately. He had always believed a maker's duty was to do the work well. What the work became in history was a different ledger. "You can't build without knowing what it might be used for," he said softly. "But you can build so that what it does for the ones who carry it is the best it can be. You can make it so that a man has a better chance coming home." That evening, they talked about responsibility without grand statements. It was the kind of conversation that refused slogans and instead measured consequences. They agreed the factory would continue to draft the most serviceable designs, machines mended easily, engines that would hold under strain. They agreed to keep rigorous testing even when pressures from command demanded faster output. There were moments when military liaisons objected. "We need numbers," they said, clipping files and nodding as if urgency were a type of argument that could be nailed onto a wall. But Brackett and others argued in the only currency they had: test times, failure rates, and the known cost of field breakdowns. In the field, the tank garnered unexpected reputations. Enemy reports sometimes mocked its appearance. Allied units learned to value its endurance. Crews painted names on the sides, small superstitions that stitched a human thread into the cold geometry of a machine. Pilots who had once scoffed at ground vehicles learned respect from the logistics of movement. A pilot named Eddie Allen wrote to the plant once, humor in his folded lines. He had been looking down at a convoy and realized the machine he'd once derided as a tractor had saved a squadron forced to land in rough country. "It's not a tractor," he wrote. "It's a stubborn animal." Yet for all the work and the accolades, there was always an awareness that machines are instruments of larger currents. The plant's output contributed to campaigns that had strategic aims and strategic horrors. When news of mass raids and of cities incinerated by strategic bombing reached the plant, men read the reports with mouths opened in collective shock. Numbers were printed, hundreds of thousands displaced in an instant, whole neighborhoods gone, and the words sat heavy like a metallic taste on the tongue. Brackett folded another paper and placed it upon the cracked piston, as if adding a new layer of ledger. "Does our work make that possible?" Samuel asked in a low voice one morning, his breath fogging in the chill of the office. "It makes movement possible," Brackett replied. "How that movement is used, by policy, by command, those are questions that outgrow the plant." He did not offer absolution. The line between making something robust so a crew could survive and making something that enabled more efficient destruction was thin. They had to live with that thinness. The factory sustained losses too. Air raids had circled close enough to drop incendiaries nearby, and once a neighboring shed took damage that tore through the inventory of a week. Repairs were demanded, not only of metal, but of morale. Men who had worked months toward a goal would find their efforts rerouted overnight. Yet in those ruptures, they also found resilience. A welder who had never led a crew would take command of a station. A draftsman who had lost plans in a fire would reconstruct them from memory. The machine of the plant proved adaptive, and that adaptability became a kind of quiet pride. The major moments, the endurance test that finally convinced commanders to accept the design, the maiden road trials, the first deployment convoy, were peaks in a longer slope of constant labor. Brackett kept a reckoning of small successes: a weld that held under a torture test, a redesigned oil channel that dropped temperatures several degrees, a bearing alloy that lasted an extra 1,000 cycles. Each was a minor miracle and an accounting of craft. As acceptance crept toward reality, the plant produced an initial run that would be shipped to theaters far away. The men who had labored over every seam lined up to see them go. Harold stood with his compass, eyes on the turrets. Robert held his left arm close and allowed himself a smile. Samuel kissed the photograph behind his locker as if to bless it, then tucked it away and stepped out to watch the convoy. When the engines revved for the first time and the beasts rolled toward the gate and the waiting transport, Brackett felt a familiar tightness behind the ribs. It was like the sensation he sometimes had at the end of a long day, when fatigue sat like a cloak. He thought, as he often did, of that cracked piston on the shelf. He thought how every piece of metal bore history. The stress of a run, the pattern made by a particular weld, the handprint of a maker left in the dim. They drove the first prototypes away under flagging clouds. A small crowd of workers had gathered on the ridge to watch them go. The machines were not beautiful in any classical sense. They were heavy, utilitarian, functional. The men who waved their hats were not triumphant in the way of victory parades. They were relieved. They were exhausted. They were already thinking about the next batch and the next improvement. At the gate, Lieutenant Jack Simmons, a transport officer who had a reputation for blunt sentences and a laugh that came in sudden bursts, clapped Brackett on the shoulder. "You gave them something solid," he said. "That's what they'll need." Brackett nodded. "We made it so a man can fix his machine with a hammer and a wrench and a prayer," he said. The convoy rolled away, its tracks churning a trail of dust that hung like a memory in the sun. Men watched until the last vehicle dipped below the horizon, and then turned back to the plant, to presses and furnaces, and to the small math of tolerances. Inside, Brackett returned to the cot he kept folded against the wall. He had a letter from his wife that morning, folded tight and warmed by the body heat of hands that had carried it. He read it under a lamplight that cut pools out of the darkness, the words soft with everyday concerns and small joys. He thought of the machines he had helped forge and of the people who would ride them. The two things, in his mind, were braided. They would use the tanks in campaigns that followed, in operations that changed maps and lives. Reports of their performance came back in parcels, some good, some horrifying, some indifferent. The plant continued to produce, to adjust, to learn. With each iteration, the metal's language became clearer. Brackett listened and wrote his notes, and the factory became, in many senses, a living thing, a collective protagonist, whose beating heart was the hum of presses and whose breath was the steam that fogged windows. Years later, when the fighting had ended and the world was trying to reconfigure its debts, the plant shifted again. Many of its men dispersed. Some stayed on to make peacetime goods. Others moved to different towns carrying the knowledge they'd learned. The machines that had once been lines of argument toward survival were relegated to other uses or retired to scrap. A few were preserved. One of the pistons, the cracked piece Brackett had kept as a talisman, traveled to a small museum where a plaque read something like a summary of work and cost. It sat under soft lights, the fracture visible to any who leaned in. Brackett visited once, years after the last convoy had left the yard. He walked along the hangar where a machine similar to that first production model rested under ropes. Children moved nearby on a school trip, tugging at coats and whispering. An older man pointed and told something of mechanics and of courage. The machine seemed smaller now than memory had made it, a compactness brought by distance. But the piston lay in a display case, its crack catching a beam of light like a small confession. Brackett stood a while and listened. He could hardly hear anything but the echo of his own breathing. He had carried with him the knowledge that what they had made had saved lives and had been used in difficult, terrible ways. He had taught apprentices who later taught others. He had learned relentlessly from metal. He had also learned the burden of indirect consequences. On the last bench, he left a small note folded and tucked into a seam of one of the museum brochures. A quiet line. For those who mend, remember why we make things, and remember those who suffer, even when we try to make things better. The museum lights hummed. Outside, the old factory was being repurposed into smaller workshops and a community hall. The echo of presses could still be heard in the timber of the city, a faint metallic memory that filled mornings once in a while. The tank that had been mocked as a tractor had long since lost its capacity to move. Its tracks were preserved only by paint and careful conservation. Brackett left the piston behind when he walked out into a day that smelled of changing seasons. His shoulders, always aligned to the work of lifting and supervising, seemed lighter. He had been part of a story that was not merely about victory or defeat, but about the complicated interplay of craft, necessity, and consequence. He had listened to the metal and taught others to listen too. He had learned that making was never an innocent act. It always connected to the world in threads that frayed and braided in turn. He did not offer easy answers. He had made too many small repairs and seen too many small failures to offer them. What he left was a practice. Test thoroughly, design for repair, keep records, and in the quiet hours, think of those whose lives the machines might touch. Outside the museum, children traced their fingers on the ropes and asked questions. Men and women who had worked the presses nodded to each other. The city turned, as cities do, toward the next invention. In the end, the tank that had been mocked as a tractor was remembered not for the name it had been given by enemies, but for the hands that made it, for the small mercies built into a stubborn and serviceable design, for the cracked piston that told a history in its fracture. The foundry heat, the heartbeat hum of a test cell, the silence in the museum, these were the motifs by which the story closed. Fire that forged, heart that kept time, a silence that invited reflection. They had produced machines that would change the map. They had paid with nights and long hands, and sometimes with a pile of sorrow. The smithing of metal had been both shelter and instrument. Brackett had kept listening until his hearing was an archive. He would pass that archive to others in his notes and in the apprentices he taught. so that future hands might build with a consciousness of consequence. When he last stood in that hangar, the lights dimmed, and the plaque behind the piston read, in careful serif, a short memorial to craft and cost. Brackett walked away and did not look back. He carried in his pocket a small scrap of paper with a note he had written that morning. Remember the men. Remember the cost. The paper was worn from being folded. On its edge was a smudge of oil like a fingerprint left on history. They had made a thing that had been mocked by others and treasured by those who used it. The factory that produced it had been secret to keep the work safe, but it had also contained open truths, that labor shapes outcomes, that choices in design bear moral weight, that robustness can save lives. The men who had worked there had not been saints. They had been skilled, sometimes tired, often doubtful, and always dedicated to solving the next problem. Their story was not a single triumph, but a ledger of small acts, welds that held, bearings that lasted, pistons that failed and taught. And in the years after, when visitors came to see the polished hull and to read the plaque, the crack in the piston caught the light in a way that told the machine's true story. It was an object of endurance and of fracture, of hope and of sorrow. The factory had been secret, but what it produced entered public memory in complicated ways. People would argue about strategy and morality. They would write histories with numbers and dates. But in the corners, the cot behind the forge, the folded photograph behind a locker, the handprint in dried oil, there were the human details that made the work real. Brackett's last act upon leaving the museum was a small one. He placed a hand briefly on the glass of the display case, as if to greet an old friend. The metal inside did not answer, but in his chest a pulse steadied, the same rhythm that had learned so many languages of steel. He walked into the street, and the sounds of the city received him. Traffic, voices, the low, ordinary hum of life resuming its slow, complicated work. He walked until the city changed from museum quiet to the particular roughness of late afternoon. Delivery vans, the flattened cry of a radio through a shop door, the metallic taste of exhaust warmed on stone. Brackett's coat, heavy with years of grease and habit, shed its weight in the crowd. He watched, as people always watch after a long spell in a place of concentrated things, for the small gestures that made an ordinary street speak. An old man adjusting the strap of his satchel with fingers like folded wire. A young mother bending to retie a loose shoe as if the future could be coaxed back into place with a knot. He did not hurry. He wanted, in that solitary way of men who had kept their hands on machines for decades, to let the day thicken into details. The way light took to the corrugated awning of a cafe. The way a delivery truck's brakes wheezed when its driver misjudged the slope of the curb. Passing a hardware store, he slowed to consider a coil of wire, its galvanization bright as a promise. He had been a man of tolerances. Small things mattered. He checked the coil as if it were a crankshaft. Inside the cafe, the air was warm, smelling of beans and lemon cleaner. He chose a seat by the window and set the scrap of paper on the table, fold showing, oil smudge visible like a token. He watched people move in and out, their faces sharp and passing like diagrams. He unbuckled the strap of an old leather satchel and let his hands rest on it. There were notebooks inside, bound in cloth, their covers cracked at the edges. A sheaf of photocopied schematics, lists of torque values, and the names of men who had tuned valves at odd hours. The archive was, as he had always suspected, a living thing, not simply records, but the residue of decisions, the fingerprints of choices. A young woman paused at the counter, then turned her head and saw him. Her jacket had patches at the elbows. Her hands bore the faint scars of someone who had worked with metal or engines. Recognition softened her face. "Mr. Brackett?" she asked. I don't know if you'll remember me. Nora Keene. I used to come through when they ran tours. My father worked in the foundry." He looked up, surprised. Memory was a map of places as much as people. He saw, in an instant, the shadow of a child who had watched a press imprint steel like a heart. He offered a small smile. "I remember names more than faces sometimes," he said. "But Nora, Keene, yes, he was in Pattern Shop, wasn't he?" She nodded and sat without waiting for an invitation, folding her hands as if to keep them from trembling. "I read the plaque before I came in. I wanted to say, thank you for keeping this, for telling it like it was. My father used to talk about nights in that bay like they were a kind of worship." Brackett considered the word. Worship was strong for a place of iron and sweat, but there had been devotion there. Devotion to craft, to precision, to the stubborn belief that work could be a mercy. "People need a way to measure what they owe," he said. "A name on a plaque is the smallest kind of ledger." Nora leaned forward. "Can I," she gestured to a satchel, "can I see what's in there? I study materials in school, but I never got to read the old notes. My father kept a notebook too, but it was lost after he didn't come home." He hesitated only a heartbeat. There were things in those books not meant for the general eye. Raw assessments of failed runs, sketches with names and the shorthand of blame. But they were also the only way he knew to pass on what he had learned without the dampening of time. He slid the satchel across the table and opened it. Nora took the books with care, fingers like someone handling a small, fragile animal. The first was a logbook of tests, dates, temperatures, pressures, entries so plain they read like prayer. The next contained diagrams, annotations in the margins where he had once argued with himself about a decision. Her eyes moved quickly, making the same leaps he had made for years. Measure, imagine, test, fail, fix. She found, tucked between pages, a photograph folded twice, its edges yellow. It showed a set of hands around a piston, thumbprints dark on the metal. "That's my father's handwriting," she murmured. "He wrote on the back." Brackett watched her read. He could have tried to claim proprietorship over every scrap, but the truth was that the factory's records belonged to the men as much as to any one steward who kept them. He watched her face fold and unknot as she turned the photograph over and read a note in crude pen. "I always said we'd make something that would hold," she read aloud. "I was with him at the trials when he stopped to smoke. He joked about the way you always listened to the metal." A small smile crossed his mouth at the memory. He had indeed been known to listen to the metal, to judge its mood by the way it answered his hammer. Listening had been a craft and an ethics for him, not only to hear what failed, but to hear what might yet be saved. Nora closed the book and looked up. "There are children who come to the museum and they stare at the tank like it's a dinosaur," she said. "But that piston, seeing it cracked like that, it's a story, Mr. Brackett. It's not just the thing, it's the hands." He nodded. "That's all any of it is. Hands and the choices behind them. The rest are accounts and histories and people who would prefer neat numbers." She hesitated. Did you ever wish you'd done it differently? One choice or a detail? Did you ever regret something clear enough to point to?" The question landed like a weight. Brackett had long prided himself on a certain stubborn clarity, the record of why things were done a certain way. Regret, though, was a subtler beast. It lingered in the places between entries, in the conversations he had not had, in apologies that had not been offered. "There are things I'd change," he said finally. "Small changes at first, a different temper here, an extra fillet there. But the real regrets are not technical. They are about how we thought about people, about how we assumed their lives could bear risk. There is a ledger in every decision, and sometimes we don't square it properly." Nora's hands found the scrap of paper on the table, the one he had folded that morning. She unfolded it with a reverence that made him think of a ceremony. Remember the men, remember the cost. She repeated the words, tasting them. That's a good ledger. He wanted to tell her the names of the men, how a press operator named Collins had once changed a set of bearings mid-run with a rag of cloth and a prayer, how a young fitter named Elias had stayed past shift to reinforce a mounting, only to catch the fever that later took him. But some things occupied the space between telling and reopening old wounds. He had learned to let names surface when they would serve the living rather than tear open the removing scab of grief. "Take these for now," he said. "Bring them to your studies. When you're ready, bring them back. Make copies if you must. The point is that someone listens." Outside, the light was turning a kind of thin gold that made the city's rough edges look more sympathetic. Nora closed the satchel and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I will," she promised. "And, if you'll let me, I'd like to help catalog them. For the museum, I mean. I don't want the story to be only polished hull and plaque. I want the margins." He nearly refused out of habit. Brackett had kept records for years because he could not trust that others would see what he saw. That insistence had been a solitude of principle. But Nora's offer felt different, not an intrusion, but an extension. "Very well," he said. "We will make a start. Tomorrow I will bring the rest. There's a box in the back of my flat. Letters, more schematics, a dozen things I never had courage to file. We'll sort them. We'll put names where they belong." She smiled then, and it was not the awkward, grateful smile of someone merely receiving a favor. It was the bright, practical joy of a person who recognized the work that remained and wanted to do it. "I'll bring coffee," she said. "We'll need it." He left the cafe with the sense that something small but resolute had begun. Not redemption, perhaps, but a settling. He walked through streets that were winding down, shops pulling shutters, the city taking on evening's armor. At his flat, a kettle sang, and the sound seemed both strange and welcome after the hum of the museum. He set his hat on a peg and moved through rooms filled with implements and paper, where the smell of oil lingered like a memory of heat. The back of his dresser, an old metal cabinet with chipped enamel, contained the box he had mentioned. He carried it to his table and sat with it as one might sit with a patient. Inside were folded notices, pay stubs, ration books, a child's drawing of an engine with happy eyes, and a letter he had never mailed. The letter's envelope had curled at one corner. He slid it open with a knife and unfolded the pages. The letter began with a name, a young foreman who had died in the year when they had first tested the prototypes and had come to the foundry soaked with rain. Brackett had never sent the letter because what could he say that would write the ledger? The letter was not an apology in the blunt sense. It read more like an accounting, a recount of choices, and an invitation to remember. He sat and wrote instead. Not a letter of apology, though those things can be necessary, but a preface for the notebooks he intended to deposit with the museum. A plain statement of what the archive meant and what it did not mean. He wrote of tolerances, of the humility that workmanship demands, of the obligation to imagine the person at the other end of a design, the soldier who would rely on a bolt, the driver who would trust a wheel. He wrote, in sentences that trembled only slightly, "Design is moral because it reaches into lives." He paused often to think, to measure words the way he had once measured alloy. The preface became, as he set down the lines, a short manual for conscience as much as for craft. Test not only to prove, but to understand. Design not only to fit the machine, but to be repairable. Write not only to instruct, but to leave the trace of intent. He folded the scrap of paper, the one with the oil smudge, into the front of the first notebook, as if closing an account with a physical token. When he finally closed his lamp, the city had grown deep with night. From his window, he could still hear the distant clatter of trains and the occasional shout of a passerby. He lay awake for a time, listening to the house settle like an old engine at rest. Memory came in small motes. The face of a boy who had asked him once, wide-eyed, if armor could be kind. The handshake of a woman who had said, "Thank you," when he had wheeled in parts they had been without. The silence after a call came through the night announcing someone would not come home. He thought, not for the first time, of the technicians and fitters who had done the day's smallest acts that turned out to matter. He had kept an archive of measurements and decisions, so future hands would not have to relearn the hard way. He had wanted, in his private and imperfect fashion, to ensure that the ledger would not be written only by those at a distance who counted things in numbers and reputations. He was learning to trust the ledger to more than stone and plaque. At dawn, he would start cataloging. He would call a few old colleagues. Some would answer, some would not. He would find, among the things he had kept, an outline for a public talk or a short course for apprentices who needed not only to bend metal, but to bend their practice toward care. He would ask Nora to come by with the recorder, and perhaps the museum curator, a woman he had met briefly, impatient, precise, the sort of person who could file things into public memory with an economy that sometimes left human shape blurred. He would ask only one thing of them, that they remember the ledger as a living thing. Before sleep finally took him, Brackett pressed his hand to his chest, feeling the slow, steady cadence he had described many times to apprentices as, "Listen for the rhythm. It will tell you when a thing is wrong." The rhythm pulsed like the memory of a furnace, warmth kept for a time, then tending required. He let his mind sink into the motif that had accompanied him since the foundry, fire that forged, heart that kept time, silence that invited reflection. The piston's crack glinted in his thoughts like a small geography of failure and endurance. When the house finally slipped into a steadier dark, he rose and went to the shelf where he kept a small tin of pens and pencils. He selected a pen with a nib that had been smoothed by many hands and sat at the table. He wrote a short note on a fresh page, not for any public archive, but for the apprentices he still planned to teach in the workshops of the city. Measure for repair. Think of the hands. Keep the record. He signed it with a name that had become less of an armor and more of a place to stand. Brackett. Outside, a tram bell cried in the still morning. Inside, his lamp burned low as he reviewed the list he had written for the day's work. Inventory, call Nora, visit the museum with the box, catalog the letters, and, if anyone asked, lead a demonstration on how to test a bearing without guessing. It was a small day's work, small as the ledger he kept, but the ledger had to be kept. He folded the note and slipped it into the first notebook before closing the satchel. He set the satchel by the door and wrapped his coat around him, feeling the familiar weight. On his way out, he paused at the photograph tucked among the notebooks, the hands on the piston, and with a tenderness that surprised him, he ran his thumb along the edge of the paper. The oil smudge on the scrap of paper in his pocket warmed against his palm like a promise. He stepped out into the street, the city already stirring with the business of a new day. Behind him, in a room full of paper and the quiet relics of decisions, the archive waited. He walked with a slow, deliberate pace, listening to the city, and, as he had done for decades, listening for the metal in everything. In the clack of a boot on a pavement, in the distant flip of a factory door, in the hinge of a cafe's shutter. There were more names to place, more margins to fill, and men and women whose lives would be shaped by choices yet to be made. He carried the small scrap of paper like ballast. At the corner, he paused to watch a group of boys skate past, their laughter cutting through his thoughts. One misstepped and caught himself with a grab at the rail. His friend steadied him with a hand that was quick and sure. Brackett watched the exchange and felt, as clearly as if he had put a hand on a dial, that the lesson he had come to keep, remember the men, remember the cost, was not merely a memorial, but a method. The work that remained would be to make that method visible and to teach it the way one teaches how to listen, patiently, insistently, and with the expectation that ears can be trained. He turned his face toward the museum and the days ahead, and his step lengthened, not from urgency, but from a renewed purpose. The ledger would be opened again today, and he would begin, in public and in print, the labor of handing off an archive that could make future hands less apt to add sorrow to the tally. He kept the scrap of paper between his fingers until it became part of the rhythm of his walk. A city is many things, market, map, noise, but it is also a collection of hands and the decisions made in them. Brackett walked on into a morning that smelled of rain and oil, and as the museum's heavy doors came into sight, he thought of the piston's crack catching light, of hands that had worked and failed and taught. He felt in that private steadiness that the work of remembering and of designing with care would continue long after his own hands were still. He pushed open the museum door and let the echo of steps follow him into the hall where the tank lay sleeping beneath its rope. The plaque, the crack, the small case had their quiet authority. He set the satchel on a bench, eased it open, and prepared to begin the careful unspooling of names and pages that would tie what had been made to who had made it.